One night in November 1948, 3 Harlem clubs went dark. 17 people were cuffed, and 2 bodies were left in the alley before sunrise. Costello had the money. Costello had the city. But within 48 hours, something in Harlem shifted that no one downtown saw coming. So what exactly did Bumpy Johnson do that made Frank Costello walk away and never come back to understand that? We go back to the night the first call was made. The rain came in sideways on West 131st Street, streaking the neon signs until the colors bled together like a bruise. The clubs were still open. Music pushed through the walls, brass and drum and the low hum of a neighborhood that refused to sleep. But something was wrong. The back doors were sealed. The loading docks were empty. The usual movement of bottles and cash and quiet handshakes had stopped, as if someone had reached into the chest of Harlem and squeezed. By midnight, 3 clubs had gone dark. Not closed. Dark. The difference mattered. Closed meant a choice. Dark meant someone else had made it for you. Bumpy Johnson stood at the corner of Lenox and 131st and watched the police cars idle in front of the Blue Moon Club. 4 officers, 2 wagons, 17 people walked out in handcuffs, some still holding their drinks, some bleeding from where a baton had found them first. The club owner, a man named Curtis Webb who had run that room for 11 years and never once missed a payment, was dragged out by his collar like a dog caught in the wrong yard. Bumpy did not move. He watched. 2 blocks north, the same scene was playing out at the Starlight Lounge. 1 block east, the Rose Room was dark before the last set finished. A bartender told his wife later that the lights simply went out mid-song, and when they came back on, men in uniform were already inside, already moving toward the register. The street smelled like wet concrete and cigarette smoke and something else underneath it all, something chemical and deliberate, like a fire that had been planned in advance. Frank Costello was not in Harlem that night. He was never in Harlem. That was the point. He was downtown, in a room where the tablecloths were white and the windows faced away from everything that was happening on West 131st Street. He had made 3 phone calls that week. 1 to a deputy commissioner he had known since 1941. 1 to a precinct captain who owed him a favor that had never been formally discussed, but was understood by both parties the way debts are understood between men who do not write things down. 1 to a third party who specialized in the kind of coordination that left no fingerprints on any surface that mattered. By the time the wagons drove away, the damage was already calculated. 2 bodies had been found in the alley behind the Blue Moon. Neither of them had been inside the club. Neither of them had records. They were simply men who had been in the wrong place when the night decided to turn. The official report would later describe the cause as undetermined. People who knew better said nothing in public. Bumpy walked back to his car slowly. His driver, a man called Little Roy, held the door without being asked. Bumpy sat down, looked straight ahead, and said nothing for 4 full minutes. Then he said, "Get me the ledger." He did not mean the club ledger. He meant his own, the one kept by a woman named Delia Carter, who worked out of a dry cleaning shop on 133rd Street and who had memorized every number that passed through Harlem's underground economy for the past 6 years. Delia did not trust paper. She trusted her memory, and her memory was perfect. Within an hour, Bumpy had the losses counted, not guessed. Counted. $12,000 in nightly revenue across 3 locations. 43 employees out of work before sunrise. 6 ongoing contracts with suppliers interrupted. The ripple was not accidental. Someone had mapped it out and hit every load-bearing wall at once. He pulled out a small notebook and began writing names. Not the names of the officers who had swung the batons. Not the names of the men who had made the calls. He wrote the names of every uniform he had seen at each location, cross-referenced against the precincts he knew were clean and the ones he knew were not. He followed the money backward, the way a man traces a river not to the surface but to the underground spring where it starts. Every trail ended at the same place. This was not a law enforcement operation. There was no moral crusade behind it, no reformer with clean hands and a newspaper headline to chase. This was a business move dressed in a badge. Someone downtown had decided that Harlem's economy was an asset worth acquiring, and the fastest way to acquire it was to make the current management look like a liability. An old man who swept the sidewalk in front of his building on Lenox Avenue every morning, rain or shine, would say years later that the night those clubs went dark was the night Harlem understood it was being sold. Not robbed. Sold. The distinction, he said, was in the paperwork. Bumpy closed the notebook and looked out the window at the wet street. In this world, power does not need to fire the first shot. It only needs to know which doors to close. The dry cleaning shop on 133rd Street smelled like hot steam and chemical solvent and the faint trace of someone's Sunday coat being pressed back into respectability. It was 11 in the morning. The sign on the door said closed, but the door was unlocked for the 3 people who knew to turn the handle without knocking. Bumpy sat in the back room in a wooden chair that was too small for the weight of what he was carrying. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice. The men who feared him most were always surprised by how still he could be. Stillness, in Harlem, was its own kind of threat. Delia Carter sat across from him with a cup of coffee she had not touched. She was a small woman with large eyes that moved fast and a voice that stayed low even when the information she was delivering was the kind that made other people shout. She laid out the numbers without emotion, the way a surgeon describes an injury, because emotion was not going to close the wound. 3 locations, 12,000 in one night. Curtis Webb is out on bail, but his liquor license is flagged for review. The Rose Room's owner got a visit this morning from a city inspector. First inspection in 4 years. Bumpy listened without interrupting. In the corner of the room, a man named Junie Bird sat with his arms folded and his jaw tight. Junie had been with Bumpy long enough to know when to speak and when to wait. He waited. Beside him stood a runner named Calvin, 19 years old, who had been moving numbers slips through Harlem since he was 15, and who had the particular skill of being completely unremarkable in any setting. Calvin was the kind of man you forgot immediately after seeing him, which made him invaluable. The problem was not the raids themselves. Raids happened. Bumpy had survived raids before, had absorbed them the way a boxer absorbs a body shot, by not flinching and by making sure the other man knew it did not land clean. The problem was the coordination. 3 locations, 3 precincts, same night, same hour. No warning from any of the usual sources. That meant one of 2 things. Either Costello's reach had grown long enough to silence every ear Bumpy had in the department, which was possible, but would have taken months to arrange, or someone close enough to know which ears those were had kept quiet on purpose. Bumpy pulled 3 folded slips of paper from his jacket pocket and set them on the table. Each one contained a piece of false information. Not dramatic false information. Subtle. The kind of thing that sounded like the sort of casual detail a trusted man might pass along without realizing he was being tested. "Give each of these to a different runner," he said. "Tell them it came from me. Tell them it's urgent." Delia looked at the slips without touching them. She understood immediately. "How long do you want to wait?" "Not long," Bumpy said. He was right not to wait long. The first slip came back in 4 hours, not through a runner. through a detail that appeared in the movement of men on a particular block. A shift in foot traffic that meant someone downtown had received a piece of information and acted on it faster than the information warranted. Bumpy had spent enough years reading the street to understand that kind of response. It was reflexive. It was the response of someone who trusted the source completely. A singer named Gloria Mercer performed 3 nights a week at the Starlight Lounge, which was now dark. She had a voice that stopped conversations and a habit of sitting near the back of the room after her last set, nursing a glass of water and listening to the people who assumed she was not paying attention. She had heard things for years that she did not repeat because nobody asked. Bumpy asked. She told him about a conversation she had overheard 6 weeks earlier between a man she did not recognize and a man she recognized very well. The man she recognized was someone Bumpy had trusted with information that was not written down anywhere. The conversation had been brief. It had taken place near the emergency exit, which meant it was not accidental. The old women on Lenox Avenue used to say that in Harlem in those years. A secret usually died before its owner did. They were not speaking loosely. Bumpy sat with that information for a long time without moving. The cigar smoke in the room had gone flat and cold. Calvin was still in the corner, still invisible in the way that was his gift. Junie was watching Bumpy the way a man watches a storm that has not yet decided which direction to move. The first price of power is not money. It is the moment you realize you can no longer trust anyone completely. 2 nights later, a warehouse on the west side of Harlem received a delivery that was never meant to arrive. The crates were real. The truck was real. The manifest was signed and dated and entirely legitimate. The kind of paperwork that a city inspector would nod at without reading closely. What was not real was the destination. The address on the manifest pointed to a loading dock that had been quietly emptied 48 hours earlier. Its inventory moved to 3 separate locations by men who did not use their own names when signing for anything. At 11:45 at night, 2 police vehicles pulled up to the address on the manifest. 4 officers went inside. They found an empty room, a folding table, a single light bulb, and a coffee cup that was still warm. They found nothing else because there was nothing else to find. On the street outside, standing far enough back to be unremarkable but close enough to see everything, a young man named Calvin counted the officers, noted the vehicle numbers, and walked away without hurrying. He stopped at a payphone on 134th Street and made a call that lasted 45 seconds. Then he bought a newspaper from a stand on the corner and read it under a streetlight until his heartbeat returned to normal. Bumpy received the information within the hour. He was in a back room at a barber shop on 132nd Street, a place that smelled like talcum powder and bay rum and the particular kind of male silence that accumulates in rooms where serious decisions are made without being announced. He had been running variations of the same test for 3 nights. Small deliveries to empty addresses, each one routed through a different chain of information, each one designed to reveal not what the police knew but who was telling them. The pattern was becoming clear. The raids on the clubs had not been improvised. They had required specific knowledge which locations were generating the most cash on a given night, which owners had the least documentation, which precincts had commanders willing to move on short notice in exchange for the right kind of consideration. That kind of knowledge did not exist in any file downtown. It existed in conversations, in rooms, in the kind of casual expertise that only accumulates through years of proximity. Costello's intermediary was a man named Raymond Holt, who did not have a title and did not carry a weapon, and had never been arrested for anything more serious than a parking violation. He worked through phone calls and dinner reservations, and the occasional handshake at a midtown restaurant where the booths were deep enough to swallow a conversation whole. He was not violent. He was something more durable than violent. He was organized. Bumpy had known about Holt for 2 years without considering him a threat. That was the miscalculation. Holt did not want territory. He did not want to run numbers or own clubs or put his name on anything. He wanted the invisible tax, the percentage that flows between power and permission, the money that changes hands before any business starts. He had convinced Costello that Harlem's real value was not in its economy, but in its compliance. And that compliance was cheapest to purchase when the alternative was visible and frightening. A police lieutenant named Briggs had been the operational hinge. He was ambitious in the way that a man becomes ambitious when he has decided that his salary is an insult. He had coordinated the 3 raids personally, had made certain the right addresses were on the list and the wrong ones were not, had ensured that the timing left no window for warning. In exchange, he expected a specific arrangement to continue through the following spring, before the end of the week. Lieutenant Briggs received an envelope at his home address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed him at a table in a restaurant he had told his wife he had never visited, in the company of a man whose name appeared in 3 federal investigation files that were technically classified. There was no note, no demand, no signature. Briggs did not appear at his precinct the following Monday. By Wednesday, his name had been removed from the active roster. The official explanation was a family matter requiring relocation. People inside the department who heard the story passed it around quietly. The way men pass around information they want to remember, but do not want to be caught repeating. It became one of those cases that everyone in the profession understood was never going to be fully documented. The club owners began to see it differently now. They had understood the raids as law enforcement, as an external force operating within its own logic. Now they understood something colder. They had been selected, not targeted at random, but chosen. Specifically, because someone had done the research and determined that their operations were valuable enough to absorb and fragile enough to pressure. They came to Bumpy one at a time, in the back rooms of places that did not advertise their purpose. Curtis Webb came first, still bruised across his left cheekbone from the night of the raid, still carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been humiliated in public and not yet processed what it means. He sat down across from Bumpy and said nothing at first. Then he said, "I need to know if this is over." Bumpy looked at him for a moment. "It will be," he said, "but not because they stopped wanting what they want, because we stopped being easy to take." He did not explain further. He did not need to. Webb had been in Harlem long enough to understand that explanation was a courtesy Bumpy extended rarely, and only to people he had already decided to protect. The runners were rerouted through new channels, none of which overlapped with the paths that had been compromised. The collection points were shifted. The timing of cash movements was changed on 48-hour rotations, irregular enough to make pattern recognition difficult, consistent enough to keep the operation functional, and slowly, like a tide reversing, the downtown money that had been flowing into Harlem's enforcement apparatus began to find its pressure points diminished. Not cut off. Diminished. Enough to create friction. Enough to make the arrangement feel expensive in ways it had not felt expensive before. To pull down an empire, sometimes you have to let its mask slip on its own. The restaurant had no name on the door. It did not need one. The kind of men who ate there already knew where it was, and the kind of men who did not know were not invited. Red curtains on every window, white tablecloths ironed flat and tight as a drumhead, the smell of garlic and olive oil and aged wood and something older underneath all of it. The smell of a room where agreements had been reached for decades and never once written on paper that could be found later. Bumpy Johnson walked in alone. No Junie. No Calvin, no driver positioned at the back exit. He wore a dark suit, no hat, and carried nothing in his hands, which was its own kind of statement. A man who enters a room like that without protection is either catastrophically foolish or operating from a certainty that makes protection irrelevant. Everyone already seated in that restaurant understood, within seconds of Bumpy walking through the door, that he was not a foolish man. Raymond Holt was already at the table. He was 52 years old, thin in the particular way of men who spend their lives seated rather than standing, with pale, careful hands and small eyes that moved constantly without appearing to move at all. A glass of red wine sat in front of him, untouched. He did not stand when Bumpy pulled out the chair across from him. That was deliberate. Everything Holt did was deliberate. At a smaller table near the kitchen door, positioned where he could be seen from the main table without being part of the conversation, sat Victor Dunn. He ran the Amber Room on 128th Street and had been paying into Bumpy's protection arrangement for 4 years without complaint or incident. He was sweating despite the cold air in the room. He had not touched his drink either. He was there because Holt had placed him there as a visual argument, a piece of evidence presented before the case had even been stated. The waiter brought water. Nobody ordered food. Nobody looked at the menu. "I appreciate you making the trip downtown," Holt said. His voice had been trained out of any regional marker, smooth and locationless. The voice of a man who had decided long ago that belonging to a specific place was a disadvantage. "I didn't come for the atmosphere," Bumpy said. Holt allowed a brief smile that did not reach his eyes. "Then let me be direct. The current arrangement in Harlem is operating below its capacity. The clubs are generating less than their potential. The numbers network is fragmented and inefficient. There is revenue on every corner that is not being properly consolidated." "Harlem consolidates fine," Bumpy said. "Harlem consolidates for Harlem," Holt said. "That is the structural problem." Bumpy had walked into that dinner with a clear theory of what the meeting was. Costello wanted a larger percentage. The raids had been the opening pressure in a renegotiation. The solution was a higher monthly number, a figure that made further disruption unprofitable and allowed both sides to return to a functioning arrangement. That theory was clean and logical, and had served as the frame through which he had analyzed the previous 3 weeks of damage. He understood within the first 4 minutes of sitting across from Raymond Holt that the theory was completely wrong. "You're not here to talk about a percentage," Bumpy said. Holt set down his wine glass with the precision of a man who has rehearsed the gesture. "A percentage implies a shared enterprise, mister. Costello is not interested in sharing the enterprise. He is interested in assuming its administration." The word sat in the middle of the table between them like something that had been placed there carefully and was not going to be moved. Administration. The word meant replacement. It meant Costello did not want more money from Harlem. He wanted Harlem itself, restructured from the ground up, operating under a management structure that answered to downtown and collected upward and left in the neighborhood exactly the minimum required to prevent open revolt. He wanted Bumpy Johnson's name removed from the operational picture entirely, not bought out, not reduced to a subordinate role, but erased. The raids had not been leverage in a negotiation. They had been the opening phase of a takeover. Bumpy kept his hands flat on the white tablecloth. He did not allow his face to change. "And Victor is here to show me what cooperation looks like," he said. Holt did not confirm or deny it. He did not need to. Victor Dunn was sitting 12 feet away with sweat on his forehead and guilt written across every line of his body. He had not simply been paying Holt's people on the side. He had been providing operational intelligence, floor counts on the highest revenue nights, cash movement timing, the names of which runners carried the heaviest loads on which routes. The 3 clubs that went dark in November had not been randomly selected from a list of Harlem operations. They had been chosen because Victor Dunn had identified them specifically as the 3 that would cause the most structural damage if removed simultaneously. 11 people had been hurt in those raids. 2 had died in an alley. 43 people had lost their income. The Constellation Club had burned to its foundation. All of it had been made possible by a man who had eaten at Bumpy's table, who had sent a bottle of whiskey to Bumpy's driver on the man's birthday 3 years running, who had asked Bumpy's advice about his daughter's schooling. Historians who have studied this period note that the line between protection and predation in neighborhoods like Harlem was often deliberately obscured by outside interests seeking to reframe community-based power structures as criminal enterprises deserving removal. Bumpy stood up from the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture toward Victor Dunn or acknowledge him in any way. He looked at Raymond Holt for exactly 3 seconds, with the quality of attention that men who have lived inside sustained danger learn to recognize as something far more serious than anger. Anger is loud and therefore manageable. What Bumpy aimed at Holt across that white tablecloth had no sound to it at all. "Tell Mr. Costello," Bumpy said, "that Harlem already has an administrator." He walked out through the front door into the cold night air of a downtown street that smelled like exhaust and restaurant heat and the faint, distant salt of the river. His driver had the car running at the corner. Bumpy got in without speaking and looked straight ahead through the windshield at the lit street, unspooling toward the bridge that would take him back uptown. He rode the entire way without saying a single word. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who wants your territory. It is the one who wants to remove your name from the map entirely. The cold that week had a particular quality to it, the kind that settles into brick and stone and does not release until spring. The wind moved through the cross streets in sharp, focused bursts that hit exposed skin like something intentional. The doors on 131st stayed closed. The windows stayed fogged. Harlem was indoors and Harlem was waiting, the way communities wait when something has happened that has not yet fully revealed its consequences. Bumpy did not sleep more than 3 hours on any night that week. He was not afraid. Fear was not the thing keeping him awake. It was the specific, grinding alertness of a man who has just learned that the map he has been navigating with is wrong, that the territory is different from what he believed it to be, and that the difference has already cost lives and money and the trust of people who deserved better. He lay in the dark and ran the previous 6 months backward through his memory, marking every conversation with Victor Dunn, every piece of information Dunn had been positioned to observe, every decision that had been made in Dunn's presence or within his knowledge. The list was longer than he wanted it to be. By the second morning after the downtown dinner, Bumpy had confirmed through 3 separate channels that Victor Dunn had been in contact with Holt's operation for at least 5 months. The first contact had been made through an intermediary, a supply chain connection who had introduced Dunn to someone described only as a business consultant interested in expanding operations in Upper Manhattan. That introduction had taken place at a midtown restaurant. Dunn had mentioned attending a business dinner that week. Bumpy remembered the conversation because Dunn had seemed distracted for several days afterward, and Bumpy had assumed it was a personal matter. He had not pressed. That had been a mistake, and Bumpy was honest enough with himself to name it as one. Junie Bird came to him on the 3rd morning with his jaw set and his patience visibly exhausted. "Every hour that man opens his club and counts his money is an hour Harlem thinks you don't know or you don't care. You need to move on him. Today." Bumpy poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Junie without being asked. "If I move on Dunn today," he said, "Holt knows the information line is cut. He stops routing anything through channels connected to Dunn. He rebuilds with people I don't know yet and routes I haven't mapped. I get one man. He gets to start clean." Junie picked up the coffee. "And if you wait." "If I wait and I handle it right, I get every name on Holt's list, every officer on his payroll, every collection point he's planning to activate, and every piece of the next operation before it moves." Bumpy looked at him steadily. Dunn is not the target. Dunn is the door. Junie was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How long before somebody in this neighborhood figures out you already know and decides you're letting it go?" "Not long," Bumpy said. "So we move fast." He sent Dunn a piece of information that afternoon through a trusted runner, framed as an urgent operational update that Dunn would feel compelled to pass along immediately. The information was precise and plausible and entirely fabricated. It described a cash consolidation at a specific address on a specific night involving a specific amount. By the following morning, 3 of Holt's collection people had redirected their movements toward that address. The address was a vacant commercial space that Bumpy had leased under a false name 2 weeks earlier for exactly this purpose. The information had traveled from Bumpy to Dunn to Holt's people in less than 14 hours. The list grew over the following 10 days. 6 direct connections to Holt's financial network, 4 uniformed officers across 3 precincts, 2 city employees whose administrative access had been quietly weaponized, a supplier who had been skimming products sideways for 8 months, and one more name, the last one Bumpy wrote down, which he looked at for a long time before closing the notebook. On the 11th night, the Constellation Club burned. The fire started at 2:17 in the morning. It moved through the storage room first, found the wooden interior framing, and climbed. By 2:30, the roof line was visible from 6 blocks away, an orange glow above the rooftops that people who saw it from their bedroom windows described later as looking almost beautiful before they understood what it was. The fire department arrived in 11 minutes. The interior was already gone. The Constellation seated 240 people. It had operated for 9 years. The owner, a man named Gerald Foster, who had borrowed money from 4 different sources to open it and had paid every cent back within 3 years, stood on the sidewalk across the street in his overcoat and watched the building that had defined his adult life collapse inward on itself. He did not cry. He was past the stage where crying was available to him. People who had lived through that period would say for the rest of their lives that the fire was deliberate, set by men who understood their remaining time was short and wanted Harlem to absorb one final cost before the accounting closed. It was not a warning about what might happen. It was a statement about what was still possible. A demonstration that the capacity for damage had not been fully exhausted even as everything else was being dismantled. Bumpy stood across the street and watched until the roof came down. The sound of it was low and heavy and final. Embers lifted and drifted east on the cold wind and extinguished themselves against the dark sky. The list was complete by morning. The strong do not take revenge when the feeling is hottest. They wait until every strike lands on the entire system at once. The street talk changed the week after the Constellation burned. It moved from fear to something harder, quieter, more focused. The men who had been uncertain chose sides. The women who ran the small shops and the rooming houses and the lunch counters that fed half of Harlem at 6 in the morning began doing small things that they did not announce and did not discuss. A landlord stopped renting a basement room to a man nobody in the neighborhood recognized. A taxi driver started taking slightly longer routes past certain addresses and reporting what he saw to a woman named Delia Carter. A minister delivered a Sunday sermon about patience and fire that had nothing explicitly to do with any of it, and everyone understood every word. Costello's crew in Harlem was not large. It did not need to be large. It needed to be paid, and it needed to be protected, and it needed the cooperation of enough people in uniform to make its presence feel permanent. That was the architecture. Remove the payment or remove the protection, and the structure became something a strong wind could knock over. Bumpy started with the money. The collection routes that fed Holt's arrangement ran through 7 distribution points across Upper Manhattan. These were not glamorous operations. They were quiet and unglamorous and functional. The kind of machinery that works precisely because nobody looks at it directly. A man picks up an envelope. Another man delivers it. A third man records the number and passes it upward. The chain was efficient and it was invisible, and it had been running without interruption for 2 years. Within 4 days, 3 of the 7 points stopped producing. Not because anyone was killed, not because anyone was threatened, because the people who moved through those points suddenly found that the next step in the chain was unavailable. A phone that rang without answer. A meeting place that was no longer accessible. A contact who had taken an unexpected trip out of the city and left no forwarding information. The interruption was bloodless and baffling and deeply expensive. Costello's soldiers in the neighborhood began to notice that their operating budget was tightening. The men who broke doors and collected envelopes and made sure that certain addresses stayed frightened were not ideological. They were professional. And professionals do their accounting carefully. When the money coming in no longer covered the costs of doing the work, the arithmetic became a problem that loyalty could not solve. A lawyer named Gerald Price had been useful to Holt's operation for 18 months. He had relationships with 2 judges who handled licensing and permit matters and could delay a review or accelerate a closure depending on which direction the paperwork needed to move. He was not corrupt in the way that men who take cash in alleys are corrupt. He was corrupt in the way that men with good suits and good addresses are corrupt. Which is to say, thoroughly and with excellent documentation of everything except the relevant transactions. Bumpy did not approach Price directly. He approached the 2 judges, separately, through channels that had nothing to do with Harlem and nothing to do with Costello. What he offered them was not money. What he offered them was the specific awareness that certain information about their prior decisions had been carefully preserved and was currently resting in a location that would become accessible to the wrong people if the arrangement with Price continued. One judge requested a transfer to a different court within a week. The other stopped returning Price's calls and developed a sudden and thorough lack of memory regarding their previous professional relationship. Price became expensive overhead with no operational value. Holt dropped him within 10 days. The 2 consecutive nights came at the end of the 3rd week. Bumpy moved 4 teams through specific addresses, not to kill anyone, but to make it understood that the addresses were no longer viable. Equipment was removed. Records were relocated. The physical infrastructure of Costello's Harlem operation was quietly dismantled and replaced with nothing. Because nothing was the point. 3 police officers who had been active participants in the original raids found anonymous envelopes in their mailboxes containing photographs and transaction records that they could not afford to have examined by anyone with authority. None of the 3 filed a report about the envelopes. All 3 requested reassignment within the following 2 weeks, citing personal reasons that their supervisors accepted without pressing. The word spread through the department the way cold spreads through a building when the heat goes out. You do not hear it coming. You simply realize, at some point, that the temperature has changed, and the change is not going to be reversed quickly. Some of the officers who had been on Costello's payroll began making themselves unavailable in ways that were professionally defensible. They were not abandoning an alliance. They were performing a calculation. The money from downtown had always carried a premium because the risk was real. Now the risk had changed shape and the premium no longer compensated for it. Costello received a report at the end of that 3rd week. It described the situation in Harlem accurately and without softening. He read it, according to the man who delivered it, without any visible reaction. Then he asked one question. Is it recoverable? The man who had delivered the report understood that the question was not really about recovery. It was about whether the cost of recovery was worth the potential return. The silence that followed the question was the beginning of an answer. Real power is not in how many soldiers you have. It is in whether your enemy's soldiers still take orders. The Blue Moon Club reopened on a Wednesday. No announcement, no sign in the window. Curtis Webb simply unlocked the front door at 8 in the evening, turned the lights on, and told his bartender to start pouring. By 9 o'clock, the room was half full. By 10, it was standing room only. and the sound coming through the walls was the sound of people who had been holding their breath for 3 weeks, finally letting it out. Bumpy was not inside. He did not need to be. 3 of his people were positioned within 2 blocks in every direction. Not because he expected trouble that night, but because the reopening was a message, and messages need to be delivered correctly. The message was simple: Harlem was open again, and whoever had tried to close it had failed. Word moved fast. By Thursday morning, the Starlight Lounge had its lights back on. By Friday, a third club on 132nd Street that had gone dark without any official reason quietly resumed operations. The owners did not hold press conferences. They did not make speeches. They opened their doors because someone had made it possible to open them without the immediate certainty of consequence. The families came next. 17 people had been arrested the night the raids happened. Most of them were out on bail within a week. But bail costs money and legal fees cost more, and lost wages do not replace themselves. Bumpy moved cash through Delia Carter's operation to 14 of those 17 families, without attaching his name to any of it. A woman named Mrs. Paulette Okafor, who had been the coat check attendant at the Blue Moon for 6 years, and whose son had been arrested for the sole crime of being present when the police arrived, received an envelope containing enough money to cover her son's legal costs and 2 months of her own rent. She never knew officially where it came from. She knew the way people know things in Harlem, which is to say, completely and without documentation. The musicians began to come back too, not because anyone asked them to, because the room was warm again, and the work was there, and the alternative was silence. A trumpet player named Henry Walls, who had been performing at the Starlight since 1943, sat down next to Bumpy at a counter on 133rd Street one morning, without being invited, and said, without preamble, "I want you to know that everybody on this block understands the difference between a man who takes from this neighborhood and a man who keeps it standing." Bumpy looked at his coffee. "I'm not running for anything," he said. "I know," Henry said. "That's exactly why I'm saying it." A doorman named Roosevelt Grant, who had worked the entrance of the Rose Room for 8 years and who had a bad knee from a Korean War injury that made standing for long hours genuinely painful, told anyone who would listen that the night the raids happened, he had watched a police officer pocket the cash register contents from the bar before the owner had even been handcuffed. He had filed no report. There was no point in filing a report. But he told the story at his kitchen table and at the barber shop and at the Sunday lunch counter. And the story spread the way true stories spread in close communities, by accumulating weight with each retelling rather than losing it. The neighborhood's loyalty was not affection, exactly. It was the specific and clear-eyed loyalty of people who had watched 2 versions of power operate in close proximity and had arrived at a conclusion based on evidence. Costello's operation had taken money out of Harlem, broken doors, put people in handcuffs, and burned a building that had employed 43 people. Bumpy's operation had kept the lights on, paid the legal fees, and ensured that the streets remained navigable. The arithmetic was not complicated. A group of women who ran a rotating savings club out of a church basement on 134th Street began quietly collecting information about the movements of unfamiliar men in the neighborhood. They did not call it intelligence gathering. They called it keeping watch. They passed what they observed to a woman named Sister May, who passed it to Delia Carter, who passed it to Bumpy. 3 separate times in 2 weeks. That chain of information allowed Bumpy's people to reposition before a potential confrontation materialized. Nobody in that chain received payment. Nobody asked for any. But loyalty without protection is a door without a lock. The new crew arrived on a Saturday night. 4 men in a vehicle with plates that traced to a rental company in New Jersey. They took a room in a boarding house on 131st Street under names that did not appear in any record connected to Costello's previous operation. They brought no visible weapons into the building. They ate at a diner 2 blocks away, tipped adequately, made no conversation, and went to bed before midnight. Calvin spotted them within 18 hours. He did not know who they were specifically. He knew what they were, because he had spent enough years watching the street to understand the particular stillness of men who are waiting for instructions rather than living their lives. They moved like furniture that had been placed too precisely. Everything about them was correct and nothing about them was natural. Their shoes were wrong for the neighborhood. Their eyes moved in patterns that had been trained rather than developed. Bumpy received Calvin's report the following morning. He read it twice and set it down. Junie Bird said it plainly. "These aren't collectors. These are closers." Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. The room held the smell of cold coffee and cigarette smoke and the specific tension of men who are about to make a decision they cannot reverse. Outside, Harlem was going about its morning. A woman called to someone across the street. A delivery truck idled at the corner. The ordinary sounds of a neighborhood that did not yet know what was being discussed in a back room on its behalf. "Then we closed them first," Bumpy said. "To hold a throne, you need fear. To hold a kingdom, you need people who believe you are the last wall standing between them and everything that wants to come through." The alley ran between 2 buildings on West 129th Street, 22 feet wide and dark enough at midnight that a man standing at one end could not clearly see the other. It smelled like cold brick and standing water and motor oil from a garage that had operated out of the adjacent building until 1945. The drain at the center was clogged with leaves. The sound from the street did not reach it cleanly. It absorbed things. It had absorbed things before. Bumpy had walked the alley 3 times over 2 days before he chose it. He walked it at noon, at dusk, and at 11 at night, each time noting different things. At noon he counted the windows that overlooked it and identified which ones were regularly occupied. At dusk he measured how fast the light failed at each end and where the deepest shadow fell. At 11 at night he stood at the center and listened for 4 minutes to understand what sounds the street contributed and which direction they came from. He was thorough in the way that a man is thorough when the margin for error is 0. The false transfer was the largest he had ever constructed. The details were specific and layered. The kind of information that takes time to verify and therefore builds credibility through the verification process itself. A cash movement from 3 consolidated numbers operations, totaling a figure that represented nearly everything Harlem had earned in the previous 2 weeks, routed through a single pickup point in a single window of time on a single night. The information was seeded through 2 channels simultaneously, both confirmed as connected to the new crew's intelligence network. The figure was large enough that walking away from it would have required a discipline that men in that position rarely maintain when they believe their window is closing. Costello's new crew was professional, but professionals are not immune to mathematics. They understood that Harlem was tightening. They understood that the operation around them was being dismantled piece by piece, and that the opportunity to take something significant before the door shut completely was narrowing by the hour. The transfers looked like a final opening. It looked exactly like what it was designed to look like. It was a throat. Junie Bird coordinated the positioning over 36 hours. He had memorized every exit from that block, every rooftop with a clean sightline to the alley entrance, every basement passage that could move a man from one building to another without touching the street. He placed 6 men in 4 locations and gave each of them a specific time, a specific signal, and nothing beyond their immediate role. He did not explain the full picture to any individual. Each man knew his part and only his part. Nobody knew enough to endanger the whole, which was the only architecture that protected everyone, including Junie himself. At 11:43, The 4 men from the boarding house entered the alley from the south end. They moved carefully, single file, close to the wall, the way trained men move when they are entering a situation they have assessed but not fully resolved. The one in front stopped twice and listened before continuing. He was good at his work, under different circumstances, in a different city, against a different opponent. That caution might have been enough. In that alley, on that night, it was not enough because the trap had been built around caution. Caution was the assumption the whole design rested on. The street noise from Lenox was a block away, muffled and irrelevant. The alley was quiet in the specific way that Harlem gets quiet when something has already been decided and is in the process of being executed. What happened in the following 4 minutes has never been described completely in any single account. The versions that survived were partial and inconsistent in their details, which is sometimes the nature of events that are both very fast and very final. What remained consistent across every version was that the 4 men entered the alley and did not leave it in any condition that required further management from Costello's organization. The rental vehicle was found 2 days later in the Bronx, empty and clean. The boarding house room had been vacated by midnight. The beds made with the particular neatness of men who have been trained to leave no evidence of presence. By 2 in the morning, Harlem was quiet. Junie found Bumpy on the corner of 131st and Lenox at 2:30, standing in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets, looking north up the empty avenue. The neon signs from the closed clubs reflected in long colored streaks on the wet pavement. A single car moved through the intersection 3 blocks north and disappeared. The city breathed around them without knowing what had just been resolved on its behalf. Junie stood beside him without speaking for a moment. "It's done," he said. Bumpy nodded once. Then he said a single name. "Marcus." Junie was quiet. Marcus Webb had been with Bumpy for 11 years. He had been positioned closest to the south entrance that night and had made a decision in the final seconds that allowed the operation to succeed and prevented him from walking away from the alley. He was 34 years old. He had a daughter in the Bronx who was 9 years old and who called him every Sunday morning at 8 o'clock without fail, because he had told her when she was 5 that Sunday mornings were their time and she had never forgotten it. Bumpy stood on that corner for a long time after Junie left. The cold worked through his coat slowly and steadily. The street stayed empty. He did not move. Men who have spent their lives making necessary decisions understand that the hardest ones are not the decisions that were wrong. They are the ones that were right and still cost something that does not come back. That knowledge does not get lighter over time. It becomes familiar the way an old injury becomes familiar, present every morning, acknowledged and set aside and never fully gone. No settlement is ever truly clean. Only the ones who survive get to call it necessary. Dawn came into Harlem the way it always came in November, gray and slow, as if the light itself was not entirely convinced the effort was worth making. The streets were wet from overnight rain. A few delivery trucks moved on Lenox. A woman in a yellow coat walked fast with her head down toward the subway entrance on 125th. A man rolled a cart of newspapers to the corner stand and began stacking them without looking up. The ordinary machinery of a neighborhood resuming itself after a long night. Curtis Webb opened the Blue Moon at 10 in the morning to start inventory. He found a note that had been slid under the back door sometime before dawn. It was written on a plain piece of paper in a plain hand and contained a single sentence and no signature. He read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He did not show it to anyone, and he did not discuss its contents. The fact that the note existed and had reached him through that particular door at that particular hour was itself the message. And the message required no elaboration. Across the city, in a building on West 57th Street where the carpets were thick enough to silence footsteps, and the windows looked out over midtown rooftops toward a horizon that contained nothing as complicated as Harlem. Frank Costello received Raymond Holt at 9 in the morning. Holt had not slept. His suit was correct, but his eyes were not. He had spent the night revising his understanding of a situation that had developed differently than any of his models had anticipated, and the revision had been extensive and had not produced a comfortable conclusion. Holt laid out the accounting without softening any of it. The 4 men were gone. The collection network was severed at 5 points and showed no sign of reconnection. The police contacts who had been reliable for 2 years had gone silent in a coordinated way that indicated they had each made individual calculations and arrived at the same answer independently. The permit arrangement was defunct. Victor Dunn had not been seen at his club, his apartment, or any of his regular locations in 4 days. The infrastructure that had taken 8 months to build had been removed in 3 weeks by a man who had apparently understood its architecture better than the people who built it. Costello listened to the full accounting without expression. He was 67 years old and had received bad news in that office many times across many decades, and had learned that the expression worn during the reception of bad news communicates more than the words used in response to it. He poured 2 glasses of water and pushed one across the desk toward Holt and said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, "What is the current cost of re-entry?" The question was precise. It was not asking whether re-entry was possible. Everything was possible at sufficient cost. It was asking whether the return on re-entry into Harlem's economy justified the cost of rebuilding the entire operational structure from nothing, in a neighborhood that had just demonstrated at considerable expense what the cost of the attempt would be. It was an accounting question dressed as a strategic one, and Holt understood it as such. "High," Holt said, "and the number goes up the longer we wait, not down." Costello picked up his water glass, held it for a moment, and set it back down without drinking from it. He looked at a point on the wall above Holt's left shoulder for several seconds. "Then we redirect the capital," he said. That was all. No anger, no threat of future action, no expression of personal feeling about the outcome. 4 words that closed an account with the finality of a man who understands that the cost of sentiment is always higher than the cost of clarity. The meeting lasted 11 more minutes and covered 3 other matters, none of them related to Harlem, all of them conducted in the same flat, business-like register. Bumpy received word of the meeting through a channel that had been in place for 3 years and that Costello did not know existed. He was in Delia Carter's back room when the information arrived, sitting in the same wooden chair he had occupied throughout the previous month, surrounded by the familiar smell of hot steam and chemical solvent and the dark coffee Delia kept on the back burner. He read the message once. He folded the paper and placed it in his jacket pocket. Junie, standing by the window with his arms folded, said, "Is it over?" Bumpy thought about Marcus Webb's daughter in the Bronx, who would call on Sunday morning and not understand why her father did not pick up. He thought about the Constellation Club, which would not be rebuilt for 2 years and which would never again have the hand-painted gold sign that the owner had commissioned in 1939, and that had fallen into the street and broken in 2 pieces. He thought about the 17 families, the legal fees, the bail money, the coat check woman who had put her envelope in a drawer and cried over it alone. He thought about Curtis Webb being dragged out of his own club by his collar in front of people who had known him for a decade. "This part," he said. The club owners held a dinner 3 weeks later at a restaurant on 135th Street. It was not a celebration, and nobody called it one. It was the kind of gathering that happens after a sustained difficulty, when people need to occupy the same room and confirm that they are all still present and that the difficulty has an endpoint that can be marked. The food was good. The room was warm. The conversation stayed deliberately away from the specifics of the previous month, with the practiced avoidance of people who understand that some things are better acknowledged than examined. Bumpy arrived late and left before dessert. He ate without tasting. He answered the questions that were addressed to him and did not answer the ones that were only implied, which were the questions that mattered and which everyone in the room was too wise to ask directly. Walking home through the cold Harlem streets at 11 o'clock, he passed the empty lot where the Constellation had stood. The debris had been cleared. The ground was flat and dark and smelled faintly of wet ash and old timber, even weeks after the fire. A chain-link fence had been installed around the perimeter. Someone had wired a handwritten cardboard sign to the fence at eye level. The sign said simply, "Coming back." He stopped and looked at it for a long moment. The street was quiet around him. A few windows showed light. Somewhere a block away, a radio played something with a piano and a slow trumpet. The cold pressed through his coat steadily. Then he turned up his collar and kept walking. The highest form of power is not destroying every enemy. It is making the strongest man in the room decide, on his own, to step back. The clubs reopened. The music came back. Harlem exhaled. But the men who built that neighborhood into something worth fighting over never forgot what it cost. Every light on Lenox Avenue burned a little differently after November 1948. Not brighter, just harder. The way a thing burns when it knows it has already survived being extinguished. Costello moved on. Other wars, other neighborhoods, other men to administer. Harlem stayed. Bumpy Johnson's, not because he was the strongest man in the city, but because he understood something Costello never did. A neighborhood that chooses you cannot be taken by someone who only wants to own you. If these stories speak to you, subscribe and stay close. More are coming. Now tell us when someone powerful comes for what belongs to your community. Is it better to negotiate or fight back? And who in your own life reminds you of Bumpy Johnson?